More often than not, when we come in as brand new white belts, we tend to give our opponents opportunity without realizing it. By keeping ourselves safe in certain positions, we not only increase our effectiveness substantially, but we also increase the level at which we are a pain in the ass for our opponent. That's what we're covering today. Let's dive in. First on the list, you're in your opponent's guard. Where do we put our hands? Where do we not put our hands? First off, you don't want to put your hands flat on the mat because you're giving your opponent an opportunity to hit a Kimura. Now, I'm not going to say that we never do this. Sometimes we will. It's very rare. But as brand new white belts, you can just focus on keeping your hands on your opponent's body. But where? First off, one of my favorite places is in the armpit. As you can see here, I am grabbing some of his fabric, balling my hands up into fists, and jamming forward pressure up and into his armpits. This is going to make hitting submissions very difficult for your opponent. It keeps you in a nice, safe space, especially in gi, where you can actually begin to start to catch your breath if you need it. If you're competing, you have to be careful about staying too long here because you could get called for stalling. But regardless, it's a great opportunity to keep yourself safe, learn some defense in the process. Plus, on top of that, as I'm showing here, you can transition very nicely into a simple guard break, where once I'm comfortable with my position, I can move my hands to his stomach while also moving my knee to his tailbone. Depending on what he gives me, I can alter the order of this. Sometimes I can move my hands to his stomach first. Sometimes I can move my knee to his tailbone first. You can play with this and feel what works for you. From here, once my hands are set in his stomach and my knee is set in his tailbone, I'm applying downward pressure to keep his hips on the mat through my hands, while also taking my opposite leg, the one that is not against his tailbone, and moving it back. I'm not necessarily kicking my leg back, but I'm opening up my hips, moving my knee back. From here, as I press off his stomach, I round my back out and away from my opponent. This makes it very difficult for him to hold on to me. This presents a great opportunity for a guard pass, or as I prefer, transitioning into a straight ankle lock setup. So with simple, effective, safe hand placement, we can begin to move into other things. We can begin to evolve and progress our situation. In Jiu Jitsu, it's really easy to put your hands in the wrong place. And if you haven't had that lesson yet, you haven't had anyone cover this with you, it can be really frustrating. So take this with you, try to give yourself room for grace, practice it, practice it, practice it. Don't expect perfection right away, but I can promise you, once you start doing it correctly, it'll make your life a lot easier. And I just want to take a quick break to give my sponsors, X Martial, a shout out. Not only does X Martial have the highest quality no-gi gear for adults and kids on the market, they also provide workout equipment and training tools, everything from resistance bands to grip work to abdominal work. You name it, they got it. On top of all that, they also have the X Martial Charity Initiative, where they help bullied or underprivileged people get help with their training fees and free gear. You're not gonna find a higher quality company out there. So if you wanna look as good as me and probably even better, get over to xmartial.com, use my code IRONWILL to save yourself some money, and look good while you sharpen your skills. All right, well, I think that covers it. Let's get back to the video. Next up, my opponent is in my guard. Now, especially in the gi, I find that a lot of white belts will either just same side grab lapels, right? Left hand to left side lapel, right hand to right side lapel, and they just hang on. And that's just because it feels safe. You don't essentially know what to do yet, and that's totally fine. If you really want to be effective, as you can see here, I'm grabbing with my left hand my opponent's right sleeve. From there, instead of grabbing same side lapel, I'm going to cross grab and grab the lapel that's on the same side of the wrist that I'm also grabbing. If I pull down on this lapel, I get some twist in his spine, and it makes it a little bit easier to break him down. If I grab on the same side, so essentially if I'm grabbing with my right hand and I grab his left lapel, he has a lot more ability to sit upright. There's a lot less twist in his spine when I pull down. And to be honest, it's just a big waste of energy. It feels safe, but it's not very effective. So again, by switching your grips to something that does work, you're gonna be a bigger pain in the butt for your opponent. Even if you don't know any submissions here, even if you don't know any sweeps, even if you don't know what to do, if you grab as I'm showing, especially if your opponent has some experience, it'll set off alarms in his head because it feels effective. It feels as if you're transitioning into something that could put him into a bad spot. We are essentially giving purpose to your grips, which will feel more threatening to a seasoned jiu-jitsu practitioner than just randomly grabbing what feels safe. Since we're in the gi, I'm going to show you another set of grips I really like to get. Essentially, I'm grabbing his left sleeve with my right hand and his right sleeve with my left hand. Once I have these grips, I can go ahead and move into what's called spider guard. Spider guard allows me to put my feet into his biceps, closer to his elbows than his shoulder. From here, I have a lot of control over this position. I can apply pressure from my feet into his biceps, which is uncomfortable to say the least. I also have a lot of control over his upper body. If he doesn't know how to get out of this can be a really tough role for him. And again, even if you don't know any submissions from here, getting to this position is going to help keep you safe. Once you set this in play, he has to move the defense. He's not going to be able to pass your guard here. He's not going to be able to mount you here. He can't do anything until he addresses these grips. So if you can maintain this position, you are essentially safe. Now, if you're far enough along in your training to know how to do the triangle choke, this is a great place to set this up because as you see, I'm loading up pressure in my left foot. This makes his right arm uncomfortable. From here, I'm gonna move my right foot down to his hip, and I'm not necessarily putting pressure in on this. I'm only putting pressure in on the foot that's on his arm. Once this position is set, I'm gonna really load up that pressure in the arm, and then I let my foot slip past over top of his arm. This allows me to push off his hips with my other leg and get myself into a great position to hit a triangle. As you can see here, I lock my legs up behind his head and I begin to transition and work through the triangle choke. Again, if you don't know the triangle, that's totally fine. My goal for this video isn't to necessarily teach you submissions, it's to teach you the position over the submission, right? If you can't hold a certain position, you have no business trying to hit the submission. You need to be able to hold and maintain that position before you evolve into the submission. One thing my instructor used to say all the time when I was a white belt was position over submission. And that really helped me get that into my mind because I would just Hail Mary submissions and I'd never land them. I'm like, I don't understand why I can't hit these submissions. They're not working. And it's because I couldn't hold the position. I wasn't building a foundation to launch a submission, right? Once you have your foundation, your maintained position, you can then work towards a submission. So if you start playing with this position, I think that you'll see that it's a nice, safe, effective, and easy to control position. Next up is mount. Now, positioning and mount very much matters depending on what you're trying to do. As you can see in this example, if I don't use my partner and I bridge, simulating a mount escape, you can see that there's a lot more movement off the ground near my hips than there is of my upper body. So for me as a brown belt, when I get to mount, I typically like to climb to high mount. I like hitting mounted triangles from there. There's a lot of different things that you can hit. When someone mounts me, I really like to push their body down and away. I like to really keep their body or push their body back down to my hips because I have more ability to buck. There's more power, there's more control. It's easier to escape. One of the easiest and most effective ways I've found to get my opponent from upper mount down to my waist or traditional mount is by taking my right arm and I frame my forearm across their waist. I then obtain a bench press grip with my left hand on my right wrist. From here, I'm essentially bench pressing him down my body, putting him back over top of my hips. From this position, if he leans forward, I can initiate a trap and roll. There are many different variations to the trap and roll. This is one of the easier ones that I prefer. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to move my hand straight up in the air, past his collarbone, past his chin. I then take my elbow and collapse that over top of his upper arm. From here, I wrap my arm over top of his arm, applying downward pressure at his elbow. As you can see, I'm able to collapse his arm, essentially taking away his ability to post with his arm on that side. From there, I'm also pulling that same side foot up to trap his foot. What that does is it blocks his ability to post with that leg as well. My next move is then to chop my arm up into his armpit. If you could picture your body like a clock, where your head is 12 o'clock and your butt is 6 o'clock, I'm not chopping at 9 o'clock. This is something that I see a lot of white belts do when they first learn this maneuver. It won't be as effective. Think about chopping up to about 10 or 11 o'clock at an angle. As I chop, I also bridge off the opposite foot, the foot that's not trapping my opponent's foot. We put all of this into play, and as you can see here, I'm able to roll out of mount and back into a top position with my opponent holding me in his guard. This is very effective. It doesn't take a lot of strength as long as you use the proper technique, and it also flows really nicely into that guard break that I showed previously. You can string all of this together to essentially go from being mounted to then passing your opponent's guard or even transitioning into a straight ankle lock, which is pretty cool. Last but certainly not least is side control. More often than not, when I see white belts do this position, they commit too far to one side. And we're gonna touch on that here in a second. Let's talk about getting in the right position first. From this position, I like to keep my chest nice and low on his ribs. I wanna commit to the side that my knees are on, not the opposite side. So think about putting your collarbones against his ribs. From there, we can wrap under the head, we can get a grip with our other arm under his outside arm and keep ourselves nice and safe. I like to keep a wide base with my knees to where my left leg or my top leg near his head is parked almost underneath that arm, while my right knee or my lower side, my south side knee, is parked against his hip. This makes it a lot more difficult for him to regain his guard. He can't turn into me. If he does turn into me, my leg is there blocking essentially his lower leg from coming in to regain guard. So as you can see in this example, I've committed myself too far over, essentially being sternum to sternum. And from here, it's very easy for my opponent to sweep me or roll me. So is doing something as simple as sitting our weight back, going collarbones on ribs, will keep us in a safe place where he can't roll us, and it's gonna be hard for him to regain his guard as long as you do all of these points correctly. Now, from here, one of my favorite things to do is transitioning into the north-south position. As you can see, I begin to take my north side arm, the arm that's near his head, and instead of being under his neck, I wrap my arm over his neck. I then drop my hips down onto his arm. I let my weight do the work. In doing this, I'm pinning his arm flat to the mat with my weight on top of it. From here, it's very easy to walk my body with my hips low to the mat to a position where my body is in line with his. From here, I can hit the north-south choke. Again, not necessarily concerned with teaching you these submissions just yet, but getting you to a position that keeps you safe. If you can get to the north-south position, this puts your opponent in a position of defense. It makes it difficult for him to hit much of anything from here. Of course, there's always opportunity in every position, but for white belts, this is a pretty safe spot to be. And once you start to learn a north-south choke, where you pin his cheek against your ribs, you begin to walk your body towards your elbow, close that gap between your arms, and then you can connect your hands if you want and squeeze a little bit at the very end to get the choke. But just by getting yourself to the north-south position without knowing any submissions here is gonna put off alarms in your opponent's head. If they don't know how to unravel this position, it's a nice, safe place for you to rest, catch your breath, while you then begin to work back to a position where you feel comfortable. And again, guys, just full disclaimer, this is just stuff that I like, right? My way is not the only way. It's not the right way. It's just one way that works for me. Of course, you guys are going to develop your own styles. You're going to find things and positions that you really like for yourself. This is just what I can give you from my experience. I want you to keep an open mind and be aware what also works for you, right? You don't have to dedicate your training to only this stuff, but all of these positions, all the hand placement, everything that we talked about, this stuff will keep you safe, which will increase your effectiveness and make you harder to deal with for your opponent, which at the end of the day is a beautiful thing, even if you don't know any submissions from these positions. As we close this out, let's remember the words of my old instructor, position over submission. I think if you guys take that with you, it's gonna serve you for years as it has for me. And if you guys have any nuggets of knowledge that you feel like sharing in the comments, please do so. I always read through all of them, and I always appreciate the knowledge that you guys share. All right, well, you know how we like to wrap this up. Sometimes backwards, always forwards. I'll see you in the next one.